Okay, and now we have question 8 from practice SAT number 5, which again, of course, is freely available on the College Board's website. 8 is a very interesting question for a lot of reasons for us as developing test takers. So this conversation about number 8 might be a little bit longer uh, than it will be for some questions, just because there is so much going on in number 8, as we'll see. Okay, let's start out just by, imagining that we are totally unaware of how important question 8 is in advancing our understanding of the test. And let's just put ourselves in the position of an actual test taker on test day. We're sitting at our cramped desk and we come across this question. Let's just sort of start from zero and see what happens. And then the discussion will sort of develop from there. So 8 says the main idea of the last paragraph is that Mr. Peters blank. So right away, as trained test takers, we know that when we see this kind of phrase like main idea, we can go ahead and ignore that. We know that the College Board often puts these sorts of subjective words and phrases in the prompt to make us think that we have to do some kind of interpretation or make us think that maybe, like in this case, more than one answer choice is somewhere in the last paragraph, and we've got to say which one is like mostly in the last paragraph as opposed to being like a minor idea, whatever. Again, we know that even though the College Board does this to try to trick us, in fact, the correct answer to this question will be the only choice that is directly restated and or demonstrated in the original text. So with that in mind, let's consider choice A and see what we think. A says Mr. Peters neglects to spend any time with his family members. As trained test takers, we would notice, of course, that this whole passage here, or sorry, this part of the passage, which is the last paragraph, right, as indicated in the prompt, the whole last paragraph totally avoids any mention of whether Mr. Peters spends time with his family members or not, right? So as trained test takers, we know choice A then is totally irrelevant to what actually appears in the part of the text we were told to look at. Now, as a side note, I want to draw a little distinction here because it might seem kind of nitpicky and like needlessly detail oriented. But it's actually really important if you want to continue to get better with your test taking. A lot of people will look at A and say that it's wrong because we actually know from other parts of the passage that Mr. Peters does spend time with at least one member of his family because we know that Mr. Peters, again, from the other parts of the passage, we know that Mr. Peters is, I'm going to try to say that clearly this time, we know that Mr. Peters is sitting with his son, right? So a son is a family member, of course. So some people will say, oh, I know A is wrong because elsewhere in the passage it told me that they were sitting together and they're a father and a son. But I want to be really careful about that. When the passage specifically refers us to an idea from the last paragraph, we don't want to refer to things that are outside of that paragraph, right? One slight exception might be something like, if one of the first sentences up here had a pronoun or something like he, we might jump back up to the previous paragraph to find out what that was referring to. That's supposed to be an arrow to the imaginary previous paragraph up there. Anyway, that kind of thing, okay, maybe, but this idea of a concept, like a full concept from an earlier part of the passage being the reason that A is wrong, that's something you want to stay away from. Similarly, like to kind of demonstrate why that's a bad way to look at the passage, if A had restated something that was earlier in the passage instead of contradicting something earlier in the passage, A would still be wrong because, again, the relevant part of the text is the current paragraph that we're looking at up here, and A is not restating or demonstrating anything that's in the paragraph that we had to look at. So A is wrong for that reason, and not because it happens also to be a contradiction of what we know about the guy from other parts of the passage. All right, with that spelled out, let's take a look at B. B says Mr. Peters behaves as if he is a younger version of himself. My experience with students asking me about this question indicates that a lot of people think that B is not relevant to the passage the first time they read it. And we can maybe kind of see why that might be the case. If you look sort of elsewhere throughout the paragraph, there are these general ideas about being young or not being young or whatever. And then elsewhere in the passage, of course, there's also the ideas of how old people are, whether the women in the party of four look like the age that they are or not, and the men being older and all this stuff. Yeah, and again here, you can see these phrases like young man, blah, blah, blah. So there is sort of this general idea of people being young or not, and there's the mention of Mr. Peters' age. He is 45, we're told. By the way, the proper, like the classically proper possessive form of the name Peters is Peters with apostrophe S. But whatever. I always like to point out moments in which the College Board's own passages do not, strictly speaking, agree with what would generally be considered to be classically correct American English grammar. But anyway, that's a side note. So yeah, so a lot of people look at B and say, well, there's talk about Mr. Peters' age, there's talk about this and that, but I don't really see it saying that he's acting like a younger version of himself unless I were going to interpret it, which I know I shouldn't do. So a lot of test takers will say B is wrong for that reason as well. Moving on now, C, we have here that Mr. Peters is very conscious of symbols of wealth and power. This is the answer choice that most people seem to pick when they get this question wrong. And we can easily understand, I think, why this choice is tempting to a lot of untrained test takers. Because if you were to discuss this passage in a literature class or something like that, and you said that Mr. Peters seems to be conscious of symbols of wealth and power, I don't think any English teacher would tell you that you were wrong. In fact, there's a decent amount of information in the text that would allow us to support an argument, sort of an interpretation kind of argument and analysis, saying that Mr. Peters cares about those things. Again, if we were not talking about the context of the SAT, but as it stands, we are talking about the context of the SAT. Like the whole reason I'm making this video and you're watching it is because you want to get better at the SAT. So on the SAT, as trained test takers, we need to recognize right away that our job is not to try to interpret what's on the page, but to look for the answer choice that restates exactly what's on the page, right? But even for some trained test takers, especially if they're just sort of getting used to the proper way to approach the test, even for those people, C might be something that you could accidentally talk yourself into without even realizing you were doing it. And here's why. So notice we have this word conscious here, right? So it says that he is conscious of something. And then over here in line 82, we have that he did something self-consciously. For a lot of people, the connection between being self-conscious about something and being conscious about something is going to seem like, this is a restatement. They're going to say, oh, well, the answer choice is restating that word. Okay, that's fine. And then later on, we see in line 84 that Mr. Peters is doing something so somebody will notice the diamond ring that he owns, right? The diamond ring on his hand. And a diamond ring to a lot of people is going to be an example of a symbol of wealth, right? So for a lot of people then, conscious seems to be up here with self-consciously, and diamond ring seems to be a symbol of wealth. And people say, okay, well, I guess then C is correct. But if we actually read the text carefully, which again is the most important skill of all SAT taking of any part of the test, is to read what's on the page very carefully. We notice that this thing about doing something self-consciously in line 82, it doesn't actually say that he is conscious of any particular kind of symbol. It says he straightens his tie self-consciously, right? But there's nothing about a tie that would make it be automatically a symbol of wealth and power to anybody, right? And so it seems he's either conscious of himself, which is literally what self-consciously means, in which case, again, he's not conscious of a symbol of wealth or power because the word self doesn't mean, a symbol of wealth or power. Or you could say that he's doing the tie thing self-consciously, so maybe he's actually conscious about the tie, but even then, a tie is not a symbol of wealth or power. It's not described as that kind of thing in the passage. So that actually leads us to the next issue, which is the idea that a diamond ring is automatically a symbol of wealth and power, which again is something that a lot of people seem to think that it is when they try to answer this question. We might think, oh, diamond rings are expensive, so if you have one, you must be wealthy, and if you're bothering to wear one, then it must be a symbol of your wealth in your mind. But the text doesn't actually say anywhere that diamond rings are only worn by people as symbols of wealth, or that that's the particular reason why Mr. Peters is wearing it. And again, as trained test takers, we know that it would need to say something along those lines for us to be able to say that symbol of wealth is a restatement or demonstration of the idea of a diamond ring. In fact, if we use our imaginations, we can come up with a million reasons why somebody might have a diamond ring on their hand without being wealthy or powerful or without caring to, display that. Maybe the person is a pickpocket, and then the ring is actually a symbol of their, skill in their profession. Or maybe the person was given the ring, and the wearing of the ring is a symbol of Mr. Peters' love for whoever gave him that ring, or whatever it might be, right? So, furthermore, even on top of that, if you're going to say that a diamond ring is automatically a symbol of wealth, like even if you still insist, okay, well, Mike's out of his mind, it's definitely a symbol of wealth, there's no reason to think that it's a symbol of power. Unless we're living in like some kind of comic book universe or something, and the diamond ring is imbued with like a magical power, but rings by themselves are not necessarily symbols of the ability to make something happen, right? Which is what power is. And again, the passage doesn't say Mr. Peters could get things done, or Mr. Peters had a way of making everyone do what he wanted, or any kind of other word or phrase that would indicate anything to do with power. So while I can see how somebody would accidentally talk themselves into choice C, for all the reasons we just discussed, we now understand why C does not follow the rules of the SAT and therefore cannot be the correct answer, even though, again, it's very tempting to a lot of people. So C then is wrong for those reasons. And that now brings us to choice D. Now, again, a lot of untrained test takers on test day would be saying to themselves, okay, well, I figured out that the first three things are wrong. It must be D. And then they would just go ahead and mark D without actually bothering to read it. But as trained test takers, we really need to remember that the main thing the College Board is hoping we will do is to make small mistakes and never notice them, right? That's how the College Board wins. That's how it gets most people to score lower on the SAT than they should. It's not because the test is super advanced. The test is a little bit weird, as we're seeing here. I mean, it follows its own rules, and of course, our whole training and everything is geared towards helping you understand what those rules are and helping you know how to use them on test day. But ultimately, when you come right down to it, the main thing the College Board is hoping you'll do, even if you understand how the test works, is just that you'll make small mistakes and you'll never catch them. So one of the most common small mistakes for most test takers is that they will accidentally rule out the correct answer early on in a question and then go through a bunch of other choices and decide that all the choices are wrong, and then they arrive at D, the last choice, and they go, oh, well, D must be right because I guess the other three are wrong. Mark D and move on. So as trained test takers, we know that we always have to consider every answer choice to a question before we commit to marking the correct answer, because it might turn out that we think all the answer choices are wrong, in which case we would know we've misunderstood the question. Or it might turn out in other cases we think more than one answer choice could be right, in which case, again, we would know we had misunderstood the question. But if you just stop when you think you've arrived at the right answer and don't consider the other ones, or if you don't bother to consider the last one when you've ruled out the others, either of those situations can easily cause you to miss questions that you would otherwise have been able to answer correctly. So with all of that in mind, again, let's pretend that it's test day and we've ruled out the first three choices and we're looking at D. We don't treat D any differently. Maybe we'll look at D and like it and think that it's correct because it follows the rules of the SAT. Maybe we'll look at it and think that it's wrong. We're going to see what happens, but we're not going in with any kind of bias. So D says, Mr. Peters is preoccupied with the knowledge that he is growing old. This choice, if anything, is contradicted by the text because the text says earlier that he, and that he is Mr. Peters, he was not aware that there had been any change in connection with the passage of time or anything like that, right? And again, that's referring to this sentence, as we discussed earlier, happens to be referring back to the previous paragraph. So in order to find out what this change is that's mentioned in this paragraph, we would have to go look at the previous couple of sentences, perhaps. So as we can see, if anything, the part of the passage we were told to look at, this paragraph, says that Mr. Peters is not aware of the passage of time. Even if we don't go back to the previous paragraph and verify that, though, in the rest of what's on this page, the part of the passage we are specifically told to look at, there is no specific mention that Mr. Peters is aware that he's growing old, which again is what D would require. Now, some untrained test takers will be somewhat tempted by D, again, because if you wanted to come up with some kind of a literary interpretation or analysis of Mr. Peters' character, maybe you could argue or claim that somewhere in the depths of his psyche he's terrified of the passage of time or something like that, but it doesn't actually say that, like in actual words anywhere on the page. And as trained test takers, all we care about is the words that are actually on the page. So we would say, therefore, that D then is also wrong. And now we're in a difficult situation. And this is a situation that's going to come up for any test taker. At least once on test day, you'll run into this scenario where you believe that something impossible is going on with the question, right? In this case, we seem to believe that all four choices are wrong. As I mentioned earlier, another thing you can believe is that more than one choice is right. That's also impossible. As trained test takers, when this situation arises, we need to remind ourselves that it always indicates that we made a mistake somewhere. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes. You're going to make mistakes on test day. But the problem is when you refuse to acknowledge that you made one, because then you can't go back and fix it, and you end up, not having the best chance of answering the question correctly. So we see that all four of these choices seem to be wrong to us. We know that one of them has to be right, and now we have to figure out what we plan to do about that. So there's a couple of choices you kind of have at this sort of moment. You could decide to skip this question for the time being and kind of let your subconscious work on it, while you're answering all the other questions that you can answer easily in the section, and then kind of loop back to number 8 before time runs out and see if you have a better idea of what's going on. Or you could decide to say, well, I don't really understand this question at all, and I realize that I'm going to just make a guess and then go invest my time in questions I feel more confident on. That can be a very smart idea depending on the time situation and, again, how you feel about the question. All those things, of course, we talked about in the training when we talk about guessing and time management, but that's one way you could go. Another way you could go is to say, well, while I'm looking at number 8 and I kind of have it in my head, let me see if there's some small mistake somewhere I might have overlooked or something. Maybe there's a quick fix to explain the situation and resolve it. So for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to assume that we've either decided to skip this and come back to it, or we've decided just to kind of hang around anyway and figure it out. For whatever reason, at this point now, we are going to say, okay, well, how do we fix this issue of thinking that all these choices are wrong? Now, as trained test takers, we know that when we have these kinds of moments, they nearly always are the result of overlooking something or misreading something or thinking that we know the meaning of a word or a phrase when we actually don't. Something along those lines. Those are the mistakes you usually kind of want to look out for. Because we felt pretty clear about why C and D were wrong, I'm going to guess that maybe the mistake is more up here in A and B, A or B, I should say, just because, again, like C, we're pretty clear on what these words mean. We talked about why each of them doesn't match up with what's on the page exactly. D, we talked about that also, being preoccupied with the idea of growing old and how that's not mentioned anywhere either, or if anything, it's contradicted up here, in this first sentence. So I feel more solid on why C and D are wrong. For A and B, though, I feel maybe a little less solid. A, we just kind of went through quickly and said we didn't see anything about neglecting to spend time. Maybe we overlooked a line somewhere in the paragraph. For B, we did find things about age or being young, and we didn't really read that carefully to find out what they said. So, maybe there's something in there too. So let's take a look now again at A. We have this thing about neglecting to spend time with his family members. Well, there is no mention anywhere in here. If we read it very carefully, we see there is no mention of any family member of Mr. Peters, right? There's this mention about a young man. There's a mention of a girl in the curve of the moon, whatever that means. There's a mention of Irma. There's all these things, but there's no words like family or father or daughter, sister, great. I was going to say great cousin, but that's not a thing. I mean, you can have great cousins. Like I have great cousins in the sense that they're wonderful people, but you can't have like a great cousin. Like you can have a great grandparent or something, I think, right? I don't know. If you're a genealogist, maybe you can send me an email and correct me, but I'm under the impression you can't have great cousins. Anyway, whatever. There's no mention of any kind of familial relationship anywhere in here, let alone any indication of whether Mr. Peters spends time with any of them. So again, it seems now that we've kind of looked through this a bit more carefully, I'm even more sure that A is irrelevant to the part of the passage we're told to look at in this question. So now we'll take a look at B again. Behaves as if he is a younger version of himself. Well, we already saw these words about something to do with being young, right? So, let's maybe focus on that. We've already kind of discussed in some detail about being self-conscious when Irma hands him the menu and gesturing in a certain kind of way. We talked about that in connection with C. but that doesn't have anything to do with him being an older or younger version of himself. So let's kind of focus in here. Now, you probably recall from the training that I'm not necessarily a big fan of reading the whole passage carefully for no reason, at the beginning of trying to answer the questions on the passage. But that doesn't mean you should never read the text carefully. In fact, as we've discussed for other answer choices and for other questions, you're always going to have to read some portion of the passage carefully. And now I'm going to go ahead and read sort of from here, where we start talking about the young man and ending up with 45, these age-related concepts. I'm going to read those sentences carefully because I kind of need to, right? Like I've looked at this question from a couple different angles. I've considered other answer choices. I still don't really have any idea what's going on. It's time to maybe get my hands a little dirty and see if maybe B has more going on than I thought. So starting then from here, we have both of these things and also the fact that his hands showed signs of the manicurist. One can blame on the young man who had his picture taken with a derby hat on the back of his head and also sitting with a girl in the curve of the moon. Whatever that means. All right. And next sentence. The young man had never for 1 second deserted Mr. Peters. He was always there, tugging at Mr. Peters' elbow, making him do things that were not becoming in a man of 45. All right. Now, I can tell you from experience that most students, or rather from the experience of my students, which I sort of latch onto like a vampire and suck that into being my experience. So yeah, the experience of my students has been that a lot of them are thrown off by this sentence because it's weird, right? I mean, it's a strange sentence. This thing about a girl in the curve of the moon, whatever that means, and having a derby hat on and all this kind of stuff is weird, and it's weird enough to throw a lot of test takers off their game, right? A lot of people see all of this text, which seems like pretty literary, non-literal, it seems like it's begging you to interpret it, that kind of thing. And then they forget all their training and how the test actually works, and they go, oh, well, I guess I should try to interpret this. As trained test takers, we know that when there's part of a passage we don't understand, the best thing we can do is just sort of like pretend it's not there, see if we can work something out from the parts of the passage that we do understand. In the training, I refer to this as sort of the bad connection technique. Like if you're on a call with somebody and then they sort of start cutting in and out, you still try to put together what they're saying from the parts of their words that you can actually hear and get, in the same kind of way. We're just going to kind of pretend for right now that all of this text is just not there. And sometimes you're going to try to pretend that text isn't there, it doesn't matter, or whatever, and it's going to turn out that it does matter. It's not always going to be perfect, but a lot of times we will actually be able to figure out what's going on with the parts of the passage that we need to understand if we just kind of pretend the difficult parts are like not there. So the other key thing going on then in this text, once we kind of ignore all these things about the young man who's always around who was sitting with a girl in the moon somehow, is this idea at the end about making him, the him is Mr. Peters, of course, right? Making Mr. Peters do things that are not becoming in a man of 45. And here actually we see what's like the critical part of the passage that goes along with choice B. So this phrase not becoming is kind of a unique phrase in English. And what it means, if someone behaves in a way that's not becoming to them, it means that they behave in a way that is immature, that's sort of below them. One version of this phrase that you might have heard on the news or something at some point is the phrase conduct unbecoming an officer, which is sort of I don't actually know if that's like an official charge or what that is, but it's a commonly used phrase for a member of the military or something. If they're caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing, then people can talk about conduct unbecoming an officer. So this idea of doing something that's not becoming, that specifically means something that's like below you, that is too immature relative to your stage in life or your status or something along those lines. So this idea that Mr. Peters is always being made to do things that are not becoming in a man of 45, this is the key phrase that tells us that he behaves as if he is. younger than he is, or a younger version of himself or whatever, right? So making him do things, that phrase, the things that he's doing, that's his behavior, right? So that goes well. And then the whole younger version of himself thing, like we said, he's behaving in a way that's not becoming of himself. So there is that. And that, my dear friends, is why B actually is correct. And it's also why it's so important that we always keep in mind that we might have accidentally ruled out a correct answer, right? Most untrained test takers would have just said, well, okay, A, B, and C all kind of seem weird. I guess D is fine, whatever. And they would have picked D and moved on, and they would have missed the question for that reason. So that is sort of the first set of things I wanted to say to you about question number 8. I'm going to try not to turn question number 8 into like a 5-hour course all by itself. But there are a couple of other things that are also really important that I want to make sure we get to. One of them is this. So just now we talked about what you could do if you thought that all the choices were wrong, but you decided that you wanted to figure out for sure what was going on with the question rather than guess. Well, what if you did want to guess? A lot of people would decide to guess on this question because they would say, well, I should invest my time in the questions where I'm most likely to be certain that I'm correct, and I don't understand this question, so I'm, probably just going to guess. That's fine. That can certainly be a very intelligent way to respond to the situation. So if you were going to guess, what should you have guessed? I would argue that if you're doing the kind of hunch guessing approach, refer back again to the training videos for the multiple types of guessing. If you're doing the hunch guessing approach, which is probably the most common one, although maybe it shouldn't be, but it works for some people. Well, then your question has to become, okay, what should my hunch be in this case, right? I would argue that for reasons we talked about, you could still be pretty sure that A is totally irrelevant, right? There's nothing in the passage that mentions any family members, no great cousins, as we discussed. For B, you might say, well, I see this thing about youth, youngness, the young man, how old Mr. Peters is, that kind of thing. For C, if you read carefully, again, you can tell that being conscious of symbols isn't there in the passage. And the power thing, definitely isn't, even if the wealth might seem incorrectly like it's got a bit more validity to it. And then for D, we have this idea of being preoccupied with the idea of growing old. That's also definitely not in there. You might at this point say, well, even though I don't understand this question, I want to cut my losses in terms of time. I want to just, pick a thing that seems like it's got the best chance of being right. I'm pretty sure I don't like those other 3 for the reasons we just mentioned. I guess I'll pick B. Again, when you're using that kind of guessing approach, any kind of guessing approach, you know that most guesses are more likely to be wrong, just because in any question there are more incorrect answers than correct ones, right? There's only one right answer. So your chance of picking that one right answer, of course, is never going to be phenomenal. But you might have followed the kind of hunch-based guessing thing that I just sort of went through. On the other hand, you might have talked yourself into picking C or something. I mean, it's all kinds of ways. I'm not saying that every hunch guess is guaranteed to be right. Of course, most of them are not. But that is one way for 8 that you might ultimately have arrived at the correct thing, even without necessarily fully understanding why. Okay, so all of the stuff we've talked about till now covers how I would recommend you approach the question, reading carefully, ignoring the word main, thinking through the answer choices, all the stuff we talked about, and then if you have to guess, guessing in that way, but hopefully, of course, you don't have to. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is how the College Board recommends that you approach this question, and specifically what is wrong with the College Board's recommended approach. Unfortunately, I would say a lot of things are wrong with their approach. I don't, as you've noticed, I'm sure, I don't bother to explain what's wrong with the College Board's approach on every question because it would more than double the length of all of the videos. And after a while, I'm sure you get the point. Like the types of problems with their explanations are generally the same over and over again. But in this particular case, I really want to discuss the College Board's provided explanation for question 8 because there's so many things wrong with it. And I'm just going to kind of discuss this thing in depth so that it means I feel like I need to discuss other ones less often. Maybe I'll just do like 1 or 2 major ones per test or something like this. Okay, now through the magic of editing, I have caused the College Board's explanation for question 8 to appear here. Just in case you're not aware of this, the College Board's explanations can be downloaded from their website, the same website where you would go to get the practice SATs themselves. So now let's see what the College Board suggests for this. So their explanation says choice B is the best answer. There again, they're using this word best instead of just saying it's the only answer that follows the rules of the test. In the last paragraph, blah, blah, blah. And as we keep reading, we see that they mention Mr. Peters not being aware that there's been any change in his appearance since he was younger, which has nothing to do with how he behaves, of course. There's a really interesting jump for me here, which is if you recall from the actual text, it never actually said that the young man who's tugging on Mr. Peters' elbow is Mr. Peters, right? If we wanted to be literary, we might have figured that out because it's not really possible that the young man is like constantly actually always next to Mr. Peters physically. So must be some kind of like metaphorical, devil on the shoulder kind of a figure. By the way, when I say devil on the shoulder, I'm just now realizing that's from like cartoons that I used to watch when I was a kid. There would always be like like if Wile E. Coyote is trying to figure out how to capture the Roadrunner, which never seemed odd to me at the time that he'd want to do that. But anyway, if he's trying to do that, there would be like the devil Wile E. Coyote on one shoulder and the angel Wile E. Coyote on the other, and they would argue like two sides of his conscience or whatever. Anyway, the point is, in case you'd never have seen that from cartoons, because I think they have different cartoons now. Yeah, so what I was trying to say though is this young man figure in the text, there's something weird about the way that that's presented, right? The character sitting with a girl on the moon and hat on his head and all that kind of stuff. Now, instead of bothering to explain any of that to us, the College Board just goes ahead and says that the young man Mr. Peters once was, blah, 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 blah. So it just assumes that you are going to know that. And if you don't know it, then there's not going to be, any real help from this explanation. And above all, none of this stuff is actually the reason why this is the right answer anyway. So in other words, the College Board here is kind of assuming that you're going to make the leap as a reader to realize and understand that the young man in the passage is the younger version of Mr. Peters. And then on top of that, it's going to treat that like that even matters. That fact doesn't matter at all. The thing that actually mattered, as we talked about, was the specific statement that Mr. Peters is doing things that are unbecoming a man of his age, which means he's behaving like he's younger, right, than he is. And I'll explain after we go through this explanation of the College Boards. I'll tell you, why I know that that's really what's going on in the question and not what the College Board says. Now let's consider their reactions to the other choices. So it says choice A is incorrect, which is right. It is incorrect, but the reason is not correct. They say it's incorrect because Mr. Peters is spending time with his son. You'll remember that I specifically pointed out this is not the reason that A is wrong. And the way we can prove that it's not the reason A is wrong is if A had restated accurately some other portion of the passage besides the part we were told to look at in the prompt, A would not have then been correct. So it's not incorrect because it incorrectly restates some other portion of the passage, right? The reason that A is wrong is because nothing in the portion of the text we were told to look at indicates that Mr. Peters doesn't spend time with his family. That's why A was wrong. The fact that he's described elsewhere spending time with his family is an interesting fact, but it's not the reason that A is wrong. So that's problematic there. Let's keep going. The reason for C being wrong is also not accurate and will lead you to choose wrong answers in the future if you follow it for other questions. So it says here that there are brief mentions of a diamond ring and manicured fingers. And then it just refers to these later on as status symbols. So as we discussed, though, it's not as if C is accurately restating the passage, but just accurately restating a point that's less important than the point restated by B. C is not restating the passage, and there is nothing in the passage that specifically indicates a diamond ring and manicured fingers. Fingers? I just said fingers, not a word. Diamond ring and manicured fingers are status symbols, and even more than that, there's nothing in the passage that actually says that Mr. Peters is conscious of those types of symbols, wealth and power, and so on. So again, the College Board is focusing on the fact that It says these things are mentioned, they're just mentioned briefly, when in fact what's really going on is they're not even mentioned at all, right? And then finally, their explanation for D is pretty decent. But going back to the other three choices where the explanation is not decent, the issue here is that if you were to try to follow what seems to be the logic of, this portion, like 80% of this explanation, if you tried to follow that in the future on other questions, this kind of thinking will lead you to wrong answers. It's very important to understand that. The kind of thinking where you ignore the part of the text that's actually the key part, right? You don't look for those kinds of key phrases, but instead you try to infer what's correct based on your interpretation of the text. That type of thinking will lead you to problems. Furthermore, again, to look at the explanations of A and C, you'll be led into wrong answers if you start considering parts of the passage that aren't referred to in the prompt, right, as A would have us do. And if you start trying to weigh, above all, like C is the biggest problem, if you start trying to weigh the relative weights of things that you think are in the answer choices and also in the passage to figure out which answer choice is best, right, or which one is just brief, and what the focus is. As soon as you start thinking about those types of issues, you're going to be totally lost. The College Board wants you to try to weigh these types of ideas against one another, and the College Board wants you to get so confused that you just kind of give up and pick the thing that you think fits with your interpretation, rather than looking for the kinds of rule-based correct answers that we've been talking about. Now, I know from, frankly, decades of experience and working with tons of students on the SAT and on the ACT and any other kind of large nationally administered standardized test, and I know from my analysis of all of the available questions from the College Board for this version of the SAT, the whole test is designed so that each correct answer has one black and white, inarguable explanation as to why it's correct, right? And that explanation is always that it literally restates or is literally demonstrated by the relevant portion of the passage. The College Board doesn't come out and tell you that, though, right? They really should, although I guess if they did, then, everybody would do too well on the test, and there would be no purpose in the test's existence anymore, which would be bad for them, of course. So, when you see these kinds of explanations from the College Board, I'm not saying that no College Board explanation is ever good. Sometimes they're good. The explanation for what's wrong with D, is good. That is correct. The last paragraph clearly states the opposite of what D says, so we know D is wrong. I'm not saying that the College Board will never tell you what's going on, but the College Board does often give these types of explanations, which are really not that helpful, right? One thing I totally even forgot to mention is that this last sentence is a classic example of a totally non-helpful kind of explanation. And you can't see me because I'm talking over a screen, but I'm holding up air quotes reflexively when I say explanation, because it's not really an explanation. The sentence says, the main idea of the last paragraph is that Mr. Peters still thinks of himself as young, or at least acts as if he is a younger version of himself, which is just a direct restatement of the prompt plus the answer choice that's correct, right? So the question says, in the last paragraph, Mr. Peters does what? The correct answer is behaves like a younger version of himself. I'm paraphrasing. And then this explanation just says, the main idea is that in the last paragraph, Mr. Peters behaves like a younger version of himself, which is, again, just repeating things, not actually explaining. You will find that the College Board's explanations are, in general, just this kind of thing, just like directly telling you exactly what the correct answer already told you, and then peppering in some other phrases that aren't directly relevant and encouraging you to think in terms of whether this is the best answer, whether something is the focus, all that kind of stuff. So I have now said, I think, I'm sure if I really worked on it, I could find some other stuff to say, but I think I've said everything about question 8 that has piqued my interest at this moment. And I really hope that you found this explanation helpful, not just an explanation of question 8 really, but also an explanation of 8, an explanation of other people's explanations of 8, and of course just in general, all of the things that a question like number 8 can remind us of, by which I mean, of course, the key details of how the test is designed, how we should approach the test in terms of being very literal and not getting sucked into this kind of subjective wording that the College Board tries to trick us with, all this kind of stuff. So please keep all of these things in mind on test day. And now let's move on to question 9, because there's still like 40 plus questions we have to talk about for this test alone.